easy to work with clay. It carves really well, and especially with fine point tools, any of this very sort of fine detail where you're just trying to remove that surface, B-Mix is a great pick. It's, you know, it's not like porcelain, but I think basic clean. All right, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a carving, get a little bit of an idea on how to space things out. I'm going to be starting with the new FP10. This new tool, it's the double V tip. It's very popular. You're not going to be able to see that at all. So we definitely have been building a lot of these recently. I hope you're excited about it. It will carve parallel lines. That's really its main purpose. I'm going to be starting by just going around this whole strip. A lot of the time, top and bottom, just to sort of add a little bit of detail, and then I'll carve out so the FP10, it's a fine point tool, straight blade, very small little, and hopefully very small blade. I'm going to move a little bit closer. It will carve two lines at the same time, and so what I'm going to do around the edge is just kind of a I'll refer to it as like a scaffolding, or sort of, I like put like the foundations of a carving together, and this also helps get the spacing all figured out. So I'm just doing this little, it's like a S shape, and you'll see the double line is making two lines. What's nice and what I care about is the space in between those two lines is what's going to be left over, and so it's nice and even. The lines are parallel. It saves you some time. A lot of the time, if you're doing a design that requires parallel lines, it's really tricky to do that second one, and so doing it at the same time just makes it look a lot better. And I'm not measuring this out at all. You could use our trimming spinner or rib to sort of check out the spacing, but with something this big, usually I just kind of eyeball each one, and by the time you make it all the way around, you have enough room to sort of guesstimate that very last one. We'll look at it here. And I'm carving on almost always carve on foam now, just because I'm always rolling that piece around. And what I'm trying to do here is I want this middle, so that piece, that little middle line that we're keeping, I want that to look like it's just coming from the top. And so that's why on the double line tool, that topmost little tip, I'm making sure is starting in that groove, and then I do a little S pattern. So here we're coming up on the sort of the last little bit, and you can do kind of one of two things. You can either split that gap and have two, you know, slightly bigger sections, or you could add two here. I think in this case, I'm gonna just split the gap because that's gonna be closer to this spacing. Again, it's not, you know, super scientific. A lot of the time when I do this, you might end up with one, you know, section that's slightly different than others, but you're not really going to notice once you're finished. So I'm going to go right in the middle here, just like that. All right, so now everything's divided up. I always will sort of recommend just do one little part at a time. If you do, you know, if you carve this whole section and you move to the next one, you know, one, you might forget how you carved that first section, or your spacing is going to be off. So that's why I find it a little bit easier just to do one little mark at a time, work your way around. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a third line, sort of using the same double line tool. And this one I'm basically going to rerun one groove and just add a third. And so in doing that, it keeps the spacing the same. So these two, remember you're looking at the color, those two are going to be the same. And I'm just going to add a third groove to all these. So it ended up looking like you kind of have this little claw scratch. And then another thing I've been doing recently, and a lot of you, if you do carve a lot, especially with fine points, play around with different ways to hold the tool. One thing I've noticed I've been doing a lot more, if I go through sort of a fine point carving phase, rather than hold it kind of like I do a pencil, I'm left-handed, I use my pinky finger, fourth finger a lot to sort of stabilize, especially when you have to make these really maneuverable turns. And it takes a little getting used to, but sometimes it's worth just trying, a different position or a different grip. You'll be able to carve a little bit smoother. All right, so made it around on the 3, and I'm going to switch to the FP1. So the FP1 is another very popular one. It's a very small U-tip. I wouldn't say it's as fine as the FP4, which is a V-tip. But this one, it's, people kind of tend to fall into the FP1 or FP4 category depending on, how fine or how, what the shape of that groove is. For this one, I'm going to use the FP1. And I'm going to carve. So what I'm going to do is that middle groove, I'm going to carve it out and make it sort of tangent with that bottom line. And then we're going to do that on all these. So a lot of the time when carving designs like this, and this is just a personal thing, but I like making, that design sort of connect itself all the way through. And rather than, carving out a lot of space, I try to keep as much of that color as possible. And you can do that by just putting lines in the right place. What that means is the way and this one's a little tricky. So the way I'm doing this now is if you follow this little colored line here, it goes up into this space. I can do whatever I want in here, and it comes back and we'll do this little loop. So I'm going to add a little groove at the top. Sometimes you got to change the orientation. And so I'm just adding this tiny little half circle. And what it's doing is it's taking those 3 lines and connecting them to make a single sort of colored line, I'll call it, that folds back on itself. And so what that's doing, so now this goes up and down into this big space, up and down. And what it's trying to do is sort of create the most movement with just the tiniest little addition. Just like that, up and down. Okay. Then on the bottom here, I already started with one, but I'm gonna do that same little half circle. Just like that. And so at the end, we'll come back, we'll clear out all this negative space here. But what I'm trying to do is just make sure this little up and down little loop makes sense. So one question I get a lot, we've been doing a lot of workshops recently, which if you're in San Diego or close to it, you can come by for a workshop. We cover all the tools, how to use them, kind of tips and tricks. But one comment I get often is on the dryness of the clay. And so this clay right now is like a firm leather hard. I like the term refrigerated chocolate. It's really not soft at all, and a lot of people are surprised by how firm the clay can be or how dry out it can be. Generally, all the tools are going to carve fine. It's not bone dry, so that's an important distinction, but you're just going to get a lot cleaner line when the clay is, it's again that sort of refrigerated chocolate texture. You're getting a really clean shaving, but you're not gonna disturb the edges or accidentally make a mark at all. And so for fine point stuff, for detailed designs like this, it works out a lot better. All right. So now I have the sort of this up and down loop covered all the way around. And this is a little bit of the fun part, but now I just like to split that middle, that big gap into a few different spots. And for this, I just do some lines. And we'll do one. So I'll do 2 lines, basically splitting it into 3 sections. And I'm still using the FP1. It's making all these little sort of outlines the same width. Another benefit of trying to carve on just a little bit drier clay is you're not going to go too deep, especially with a lot of these straight blade tools. Technically, the fine points are a straight blade. But one issue is that, they're not an issue, but since they're sharp, they will cut in there. And when you have a little bit firmer clay, it's not just going to sink in, and you have a lot more control over the width of that line, the depth of it. And especially on something like a B-Mix where it is really pretty smooth, you don't have to worry about, running into grog or anything. I mentioned while I was trimming that normally I like using a slip, which kind of maintains that clay characteristic. This is an underglaze, and it's doing okay on this. If it was any drier, I might be worried about it cracking, or you'd get tiny little jagged edges along carving. But it's also a pretty thin layer of underglaze, so you'll still get color. But slip, I always recommend. All right, so now all these are here. So there's a couple ways, let me see, that we can do the last one. I'm gonna add one more line. The bottom here. I like to do all I can with one tool at a time, so you're not switching back and forth. So all I'm doing on this one is just extending that line right there. All right, so there's some areas I'm gonna get rid of last, and it'll make a lot more sense. But right now I've got these like 3 little leaves, and I'm gonna treat them like leaves. Another thing I like to use, so I'm gonna switch to the FP6 now. This is a small little, oh, you're not gonna be able to see that either. So, small little circular shape with these little shoulders. We'll show there as well. This one's very maneuverable. It makes a little bit wider groove, but as you kind of tilt and rock back and forth, it'll keep that width because of those shoulders. I for making little sort of circles. Very consistent, and all I do is just give like a little twist. And so at the bottom of each of these lines, I'm going to add a little circle. And this will just add a little bit more kind of contour to these leaves. Basically, I'm going for that effect of like a vine with some leaves that wraps itself around. And this is the FP6. You can do something similar with some other U-tips, so like the FP3 or the 5. Those are a little bit larger U-tip. You can do something similar, but what I like about the 6 is it just makes that sort of perfect little circular indent. Sometimes I feel like a lot of the early work to something is just sort of prep, and then it starts looking good towards the end where you just kind of take off some of the sharp corners. So I'm gonna switch here to, I think this will work. Let me try a couple. So there's two tools I can use. I use them similarly, but sometimes they have a little bit of a difference. So one's the FP9 or the FP7. So the 7 is, it's similar to like the wedge or the 6, but it just has like a very slight arc on top. So it's not flat. It's similar, similar to the 8. They're basically the same shape, except one's flat, one has a little bit of an arc. The 7 is nice because it won't leave lines as you're clearing space out. Or if you're clearing that negative space, it's not going to leave a line on either side. Subtle arc, it's about 3-4 millimeters wide, whereas the FP9, it has this little indent and a little bit sharper corner. So you can get into along an edge with that corner, but then use that rounded side to sort of fade it out, and you don't have as much of, again, you're not going to leave a line, and you can sort of scoop or fade out a larger area. So what those look like, what I'm trying to do is just barely take away some of these sharp corners. And right now the 9 is working pretty well just to reach in there. And then come back and I'm gonna try to take away all these sharp corners. So I'm just adding a subtle little curve. So I'll do one. This is with the 9. I'll add one here. So just like that. And so you can see the difference between sort of the outline version, I'd call it, and then now with all those corners removed. That was with the 9. I'll use the 7. Sometimes one just fits a little bit better with the shapes that you're trying to make. I do use the 7 a lot for this. And because that underglaze is so thin on top, I'm trying to be very careful not to sort of make any, especially here, every little sort of mark counts. And I'm not sure which one's better for this particular one. I kind of like I use the 7 quite a bit, so I'm sort of used to the corners of it. So I'm gonna go around and do all these little circular parts with the 7. And then the other thing I will use the 7-4. So I'm gonna go around and do all this at once is like little areas like this that are just purely negative space, little triangles or corners. It works great to get rid of those, and you can leave a fairly smooth surface because of that slight little arc on top. And then like right here, trying to get up into a corner, you know, you can turn it, you have a little bit of a shoulder, a little bit of an edge you can get in there. So you can make it into fairly tight spaces. This is a pretty good example of probably the tightest space I'd use it for right there. And these are a lot of like little sort of touch-ups, but I've noticed like once it's fired and that color gets a lot brighter, you notice a lot of these lines, you know, if they have a little sharp corner or a little crack in it, you notice it a lot more once everything's fired. So it just helps to kind of take your time and get in there. This is always the most tedious part, mostly because I try to be really careful. All right, we're almost through it. Okay, last one. All right, so all those little circles are carved out. All of these little triangles are gone. I'm gonna go up top and so one thing I need to add is sort of a straight line between this corner and this one. This will help later on. So switching back to the FP1. Go. So a lot of the time, and I'm going to use the FP9 now, but when getting rid of, I forgot one. When getting rid of some negative space, I find it easier to use a fine tool like the FP1 or 4 to draw that line first, and then follow up with kind of like your clearing tool, because you're gonna get a lot cleaner edge that way. Otherwise, if you're trying to sort of draw the groove that you want at the same time as clearing, it doesn't always go that well. So I tend to, like I did, carve that single little groove first, and then you can pop back around. Here's one I didn't do it on. It's always a little bit trickier. And a lot of people do ask, what's the FP9 for? And it's sometimes tricky to sort of describe these exact scenarios, but when you find yourself in them and you're carving, and you wish you had a tool you could sort of has a corner, you can focus on one edge and sort of that other edge will sort of fade out. That's the FP9. That's really what it's meant to do. And all the fine point tools sort of are that way. They all have these very specific scenarios they're best for. Okay. All right, so now I can just round all these corners. And if I'm rolling this thing around a lot, it's because I'm trying to find just like that right angle, kind of the perfect angle to do it with. Another reason to make sure you have a good surface to work on. And all the fine point tools, since they're a straight blade, you can flip them so they don't have, a left or a right to them. So I'll flip this back and forth depending on what direction I'm going. Which is another, reason to maybe try holding it differently, or sometimes it's hard to flip back and forth if I'm holding it like a pencil. I have to take my hand off versus being able to do really sort of steadily. So play around with that. and it'll be cool. So once this is fired, this middle part that I'm working on, it's mostly blue, but the top has some of that orange in there, and should be a pretty nice little blend. It's always fun to kind of see, even though it looks light right now, those colors pop quite a bit. And then I like doing stuff like this because they're really easy to glaze. So, you know, you can do the inside of the bowl. I'll use our glaze fountain, one color, you know, clear, something simple, and then the outside is just, you know, brush on some clear over the underglaze, and not complicated, and it usually turns out really well. You don't have to worry about, you know, clear is pretty reliable as long as you have a reliable clear. But it doesn't take that long. You don't have to sponge a lot on. You don't really have to even brush that carefully. You just sort of cover the whole area, and then I leave the rest bare clay, so you don't have to worry about wiping any glaze off. It's pretty straightforward. So that's another reason to sort of check out. Just you know, put a little bit under glaze, do a little bit of carving, makes it easy. If you're still watching, thanks for hanging in there. So sometimes on things like this, it's best to just take your time and make sure it turns out good. And this is, you know, in the beginning I was talking about, just do one little part at a time. So, and this is a good example of it, where, you know, if I had done a whole one of these, I might have forgotten what tool I used for what, or you really, in the course of moving around the whole bowl, you kind of build up like a little bit of a muscle memory of what angle you had the tool at, how you're holding it, the best way to remove these tiny little areas of clay. So just another reason I recommend just doing a little part at a time. And this is the last one for this little step. Alrighty, so made it all the way around. There's a couple little spots I'm going to get rid of underglaze buildup. All right, so the very last little part of this, kind of have a blobby looking leaf, and we can make it a little more leaf-like. I'm gonna switch to the FP4. So this is kind of the alternative to the FP1. It's technically more of a V-tip, and you can get a little bit finer line, especially if you're very delicate with it. You don't push as hard. Another reason, go back to that sort of refrigerated chocolate, drier leather hard phase. And on this one, Content. Oh man, I don't have a good content clear to recommend, unfortunately. I usually fire at cone 5.6, and um, I use a Laguna dry mix clear. It works well. Um, I think if I had to give any clear recommendation, it's just apply thin. You really don't need a lot, especially with an underglaze or anything. The thinner, not the thinner the better, but really pretty thick. You don't kind of get, it won't pop, and it'll make everything super shiny. And so here I'm just adding a little, just kind of a U-shaped detail to the top of each little leaf shape. And what's sort of cool about the FP4 is it's so fine at the end. There's some little areas, like when you're rounding a corner, that's carving, but then if you need to actually just go a little bit sort of sideways, it'll still be okay. You'll still kind of clear out that underglaze. It's just very maneuverable. So a lot of the sort of the regular P tools that we have, like a P12 it's a V-tip, but it doesn't have as small sort of maneuverable as a blade as this. So that's why the fine point are really the best for any kind of like sort of drawing when you're getting into very tight curves, sort of drawn shapes. So sometimes whenever I have like a big sort of empty spot, this is a good way to fill it. And so this FP4, any little areas that have to get, super little thin. You can get a pretty fine line with it. We got a question. Specific resource. So a lot of inspiration. Sometimes it's fun to sort of look outside. I like a lot of plants, plants, flowers, trees. You'd be surprised what, or sort of how simple shapes there are just kind of out in nature. Like you go look at some leaves or something, and if you break it down, it's a really pretty simple shape, and then just adding little details like this, they make it look very complicated, but it's not. It's all just sort of basic, like a leaf shape or this is a line. So that's at least where I sort of come from. Even geometric stuff you'll find out there. And then colors too, you'd be surprised, you just start looking at color combinations, and there's a lot outside. Okay, so last one of that. Believe it or not, I'm almost done. So I think what might look neat is just kind of making that top line a little thicker. So I'm gonna use the FP6 for this again. That sort of straight top line, just widening it a little bit, and rather than using the same FP4, switching to the FP6. So quick reminder on the dryness. Someone was asking how dry the bowl is. So it's pretty dry. You can even see that the rim, even over the course of this video, has been drying out to almost bone dry. It's kind of at that refrigerated or like frozen chocolate stage is kind of my favorite term for it. You get these really clean shavings barely on the surface without sinking in too deep. And so that the biggest question and sort of the biggest comment I get in our workshops is how dry the clay is. And it's not, again, not bone dry, but a lot drier than typically what people might be used to or think they can get away with. So a lot of the time, if you're gonna carve something, I just say, set it out for just a few more minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and you'd be surprised, the difference that it makes. The tools will go through no problem. Even some of the carving tools you can get by on a little bit firmer clay, and in general, you just get a little bit better, cleaner result. And so one thing that's neat about this is all those little sharp corners I took off kind of gives it, a lot more like bubbly, organic look. You could do the same thing, but leave some of those sharp corners, and it'll have a sort of a sharper, yeah, like a sharper look to it. And that's sort of fun to just experiment with, which is, even if you have a design, just rounding a corner a little bit or adding a little line like this can add quite a bit, or quite a bit of sort of like detail and sort of depth to the shape that you're making. And then sometimes you gotta empty that out. And this one's definitely, of course, it takes longer because it's a bigger bowl. On something like a cup, rather than, however many of these little sections are, you don't have that many going around a small cup, so it goes quite a bit faster. And this is not even that big of a bowl. There we go. So we're back to the beginning. Okay, so I think we'll leave that edge like that. I'm gonna just feel the bottom quick. So I always add something on the bottom. In this case, the same sort of design, and I kind of do like a quick version of it. So just go around and so this way, you or someone else picks it up, it's not so boring on the bottom. So you'll notice it's just sort of a lot of the same steps, just a little more simplified. Like that. There we go. And then we'll add sort of the easy way of that top part is I'll make the wide section first. It doesn't have to be as drawn out, you know, at this scale. And just quick little lines like that. And there you go. So we got a carving on the side and the bottom. We'll keep this safe and fire it, and then we'll definitely get to some glazing a little later on. Next week, I think we'll show maybe a different design on a cup with some more fine point tools, or possibly something else. If you want to see something specific, you know, comment, and I'll sort of tailor it to what you guys want to see. But hopefully this was interesting and you know, inspired you to kind of come up with something cool, or, you know, go outside, find some leaves or a flower, or, you know, something in nature, and you know, make it into a bowl or make it into a carving. Used a fair amount of the fine point tools, so sort of try to give an example of some of those kind of funny ones like the FP9 or the 6 or like that new 10, where they're used, how they're used, and just those really specific scenarios where they really come in handy. So thanks for joining. I know it's another long one, but they're fun to do and hopefully fun to watch. So other than that, have a good rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you next week.